They were handed scraps, big feet, corn husks, weeds pulled from fields. And yet, from almost nothing, enslaved people created a food culture that not only carried them through one of the darkest chapters in American history, but still feeds this nation today. These weren't just meals, they were lifelines. Each dish bore the imprint of pain, resilience, and defiance. Each bite was testimony to survival. And yet, this story, this hidden foundation of American cuisine, rarely finds its way into history books. Tonight, we uncover the foods that sustained enslaved people. The meals forged out of desperation, that became the roots of traditions we still taste on our tables. Some of these foods may shock you, others may feel familiar. All of them tell the story of endurance under unimaginable conditions. Let's begin with the simplest of rations. Parched corn. Imagine long days spent under the blazing sun, working fields from dawn until dusk. There was no guarantee of a hot meal, no assurance of nourishment waiting back in the quarters. In moments of crushing hunger, enslaved people turned to a portable solution. Dried kernels of corn toasted over heat until they browned and popped with a faint flavor. Parched corn was their trail mix, except it wasn't meant for hikers or explorers. It was survival food. Easy to carry, long-lasting, and just enough to keep the body moving through relentless labor. Sometimes, it was the only food a person ate all day. Today, we might recognize its echo in kettle corn at fairs, or corn nuts on gas station shelves. But back then, it was life or death, an energy source that fueled forced labor across sprawling plantations. And here lies the irony, that simple survival food became the seed of Southern culinary traditions that still thrive. A reminder that what we eat for leisure today was once consumed only to endure. But survival was never steady. What happened when the corn ran out? The answer was mush cornmeal, boiled with water and salt, a heavy porridge with no milk, no butter, none of the luxuries we associate with comfort food today. Known in countless slave narratives, cornmeal mush was so common that it became synonymous with life in the quarters. At times, the mush was dumped into long troughs, where children gathered side by side, scooping food as if they were livestock. Brutal and dehumanizing, yet the mush filled empty stomachs enough to press on through another day. Cold leftovers were sliced and fried the next morning, stretching meals a little further. That act of stretching, of making something last beyond its limits, was survival itself. And the shadow of it lingers. Southern fried cornmeal cakes. Italian-style polenta frizzle, of them rooted in a food once stripped bare of comfort and meant only to ward off starvation. When scraps of meat disappeared, and they almost always did, enslaved people turned to the land itself. Bitter greens that plantation owners dismissed became the backbone of life-saving stews. Turnip greens, boiled soft, often flavored only with salt, or, if fortune allowed, a scrap of pork fat. It wasn't indulgence, it was endurance. And yet, in those pots, simmering over smoky fires, there was more than sustenance. There was strength. A pot of greens warming bodies against freezing winds in cabins with little protection was a symbol of endurance. Over time, that bitter bite became familiar, even loved. Techniques emerged to soften the flavor. Long simmering, mixing with roots, or layering with herbs. Today, collard greens, mustard greens, and turnips still sit at the center of Southern tables. For the enslaved, though, it began with desperations, stewing what others discarded into meals that carried hope through the winter. But sustenance wasn't always rooted in bitter leaves. From Africa came seeds of resilience. Cowpeas, later known as black-eyed peas. Hardy, protein-rich, and resilient in poor soil, these beans grew into lifelines. Cooked into simple stews, sometimes salted, sometimes flavored with scraps. They carried not only calories, but identity. For enslaved Africans, eating cowpeas wasn't just nourishment, it was connection. Across the ocean, cowpeas had been part of diets for generations. Every spoonful tied the enslaved back to a homeland torn away from them. Today, we see echoes in Hoppin' John, a dish symbolizing luck and prosperity in Southern tradition. But its origins were born from survival and memory. African knowledge transplanted into hostile soil, still flourishing despite it. When cultivated crops weren't enough, survival meant turning to the wild. Dandelion greens, today dismissed as backyard weeds, were once salvation. Boiled down until their bitterness softened, sometimes brightened with a splash of vinegar, they became thin broths or chewy side dishes. They didn't just fill bellies, they provided iron, vitamins, and strength. Enslaved cooks, drawing on knowledge of plants carried from Africa and learned anew on American soil, understood that weeds could heal as much as feed. Centuries later, dandelion greens would reappear in restaurants and health food stores as trendy soup teas, sold for a price once unimaginable. Yet their original role was humble survival, medicine for bodies forced beyond exhaustion. And then there was the taste of sweetness, a rarity in lives filled with bitterness. Plantation sugar was wealth, but enslaved people rarely touched it. Occasionally, they were given rations of molasses, thick, sticky, dark. It wasn't candy, but it was precious. Stirred into water, molasses became a crude energy drink, delivering quick calories and a brief reprieve from hunger. For children, it was a treat. For adults, it was fuel. Sometimes it was even medicine, mixed with herbs to soothe illness. This humble ration planted seeds of flavor that echo in Southern barbecue sauces, desserts, and baked goods today. A reminder that even sweetness born of oppression left its mark on American cuisine. Yet, for every rare gift like molasses, there were endless scraps. Salt, pork, trimmings, rinds, fat, bits too unfit for the plantation has found their way into enslaved hands. Fried, they released grease to seasoned beans and greens. Boiled, they added chew to otherwise plain stews. When even the meat was gone, the fat itself flavored cornmeal or bitter leaves. What owners dismissed as waste became a cornerstone of cooking. And in those transformations, enslaved people left behind not only survival food, but the smoky, salty flavors that would one day define soul food. What once meant scraping by now means comfort, tradition, and celebration. When the gardens thinned and the fields yielded little, ingenuity became the weapon against hunger. Pumpkins growing wild in corners of the fields and bitter greens pulled from the earth were tossed into the same pot, simmered into what was known as pottage. This dish was never about celebration. It was survival chemistry. The sweetness of pumpkin flesh balanced the harsh bite of wild greens, producing a stew that carried families through lean months. Sometimes, only water and salt flavored the pot. Other times, fortune allowed for a scrap of pork rind or a rogue onion. Nothing went to waste. Each spoonful was an act of endurance, of making the bitter and bland into warmth and strength. And though it began as desperation, that pairing of sweet and bitter left its mark. Today's Southern pumpkin soups and seasonal stews trace their lineage back to the quarters, where survival itself dictated the recipes. Yet the pumpkin held more than flesh. The seeds scooped, cleaned, and roasted became rare treasures in an otherwise bleak diet. For children, especially, roasted pumpkin seeds meant joy, crunchy, salty if possible, and nourishing with fats and proteins that were otherwise scarce. Something so simple became a shield against the pain of hunger. What most plantation kitchens threw away, enslaved families cherished. And it's no coincidence that today pumpkin seeds sell as superfoods, packaged and marketed for profit. What once meant surviving another day has become a snack for the modern consumer. The transformation speaks volumes about how necessity becomes tradition and how memory survives in unexpected places. The turnip root offered another form of salvation. Dug from the dirt, roasted in the ashes of a fire until soft, it became a substitute for bread or meat when neither was available. Imagine the smell of a root blackened on the outside, steaming within, its bitterness softened into faint sweetness. For enslaved families, roasted turnips weren't indulgence. They were filler food, eaten plain or mashed, sometimes fried in pork grease if scraps were spared. And yet, that smoky richness gave a sense of comfort. Something warm to hold in frozen hands, something that mimicked abundance when there was none. Over time, roasted root vegetables carved their place into southern and even holiday cooking. Once tools of survival, they became staples of tradition. But the most powerful food stories are those tied directly to memory and homeland. Okra, carried across the Atlantic in the mines, and sometimes the very hands of enslaved Africans, thrived in southern soil. Combined with corn, another staple of the diet, it became okra and corn, maca, sticky, sometimes slimy. Stew that was as filling as it was symbolic. In Africa, okra stews and porridges were common. By mixing okra with American corn, enslaved people preserved not only nutrition but culture. Each bowl was resistance, a refusal to let go of identity even when everything else was stripped away. And the echoes of that resistance live on. Gumbo, succotash, and countless southern okra dishes carry the DNA of that mash, transforming survival into heritage. Still, not all food could be planted or carried. Sometimes survival meant searching the woods, seeking out sweetness in unlikely places. The persimmon tree called paiman, in some quarters offered small, orange fruits that looked unremarkable, but carried lessons of patience and timing. Picked too early, they puckered the mouth with unbearable bitterness. But wait until frost kissed the fruit, and they transformed into soft, golden sweetness. Enslaved families knew this secret. They foraged late, ate the fruit raw, mashed it into pulp, dried it into thin cakes for carrying into the fields, or stirred it into water for a sweet drink. The persimmon wasn't just food. It was knowledge of the land, a reminder that survival required more than endurance, it required wisdom. Today, persimmons turn up in puddings, breads, even wines, but their roots in survival remain a hidden truth. Rice plantations in the Carolinas tell another story. Rice was wealth, white gold for plantation owners, but enslaved families rarely tasted the polished grains. What they received were middlings, the broken fragments left after milling. To planters, they were waste. To the enslaved, they were life. Those fragments were boiled into thin porridge, salted if possible, stretched with beans or greens when available. It wasn't filling for long, but it kept bodies moving. The cruel irony is that many of the enslaved came from African regions with centuries of rice cultivation expertise. They knew how to coax flavor and sustenance even from broken grains. In that knowledge lay survival, and in their cooking lay the birth of traditions that still ripple today: rice soups, porridges, and stews across southern kitchens and beyond. What began as scraps became the foundation of culinary identity. In the woods, tangled vines yielded muscadine grapes, thick-skinned, messy, bursting with juice. These weren't the neat, seedless grapes of modern supermarkets. They stained hands and mouths purple, tart and sweet, wild and untamed. For enslaved families, they were more than food. They were freedom. grapes that grew outside plantation control, gifts of the land available to anyone willing to forage. Children gathered them, adults mushed them into pulp or boiled them into juice. In abundance, they were preserved as syrup, a rare luxury stretched through lean months. Muscadines were more than nourishment, they were reminders that the land still held generosity even in times of cruelty. Today, they are bottled as jellies, juices, and wines, celebrated as native southern fruit. Yet their story begins in the shadows, as freedom food found beyond the reach of overseers. Sometimes, survival meant accepting what was given from the slaughterhouse. Cuts so unwanted they were considered waste. Cow tongue boiled for hours until tender, then sliced thin. It wasn't indulgent. It was chewy, heavy, sometimes flavored with a pinch of salt or vinegar if available. But it was real meat, rare protein in diets dominated by grains and greens. For families who stretched cornmeal into mush and roots into bread, a piece of tongue felt like victory. And here is the irony. What was once considered scraps for the enslaved is now prized in cuisines around the world. From Mexican tacos de lengua to Jewish deli sandwiches, beef tongue today is delicacy. Its journey from rejection to luxury is a reminder of how food carries history, even when history is buried. Not all scraps were edible at first glance. Take tripe, the stomach lining of cattle. For plantation kitchens, it was garbage. For the enslaved, it was an opportunity. Boiled endlessly to soften its rubbery texture. Seasoned with onions or herbs, if fortune allowed, tripe became stew. Thick, chewy, pungent, but filling. It offered protein when none was otherwise given. In these dishes, enslaved cooks displayed ingenuity, transforming what others refused to eat into meals that not only nourished but laid the groundwork for traditions. Today, tripe appears in global delicacies: Italian, trippa alla romana, Mexican menudo, and more. Yet, in the American South, its roots are survival food from the quarters. Proof that necessity often shapes cuisine more than choice. The same was true of pig intestines, later known as chitlins or chitlins. The task was grueling: washing, boiling, scraping until clean, then simmering in pots for hours. The smell alone was infamous, lingering across cabins and fields. But when there was little else, chitlins fed families, served with vinegar, spiced if possible. They became not just food, but symbols of endurance. Over time, chitlins evolved into a delicacy in African American cuisine, eaten during holidays and celebrations. Their preparation tied to tradition, but their beginnings were far from festive. They were survival in its rawest form, transforming refuse into sustenance. Sometimes, survival depended on the smallest, most fragile ingredients. Eggs, gathered from hens scratching near cabins, were rare gifts. A single egg could transform mush into a richer dish, bind roots into cakes, or be boiled and shared among children. When an egg was saved, it wasn't just food, it was strategy. Mothers often chose to give eggs to children or the sick, understanding that fragile health could mean the difference between life and death. Today, eggs are among the cheapest proteins in markets. But for the enslaved, each egg carried weight beyond its shell. It was hope in fragile form. There were also insects, though rarely spoken of in history books. Grasshoppers roasted over fire, crickets ground into coarse meal, and even worms unearthed from wet soil. These weren't delicacies, nor were they chosen with pride. They were emergency food, consumed when rations dwindled and hunger threatened collapse. The knowledge of eating insects likely came from African traditions, where such foods were considered rich in protein. On American soil, they became the last resort. In their crunch and chew, there was no celebration, only the raw instinct to survive. And yet, in a twist of history, today, edible insects are marketed as sustainable protein, packaged in glossy bags and sold as health snacks. What enslaved people once ate to stave off starvation is now rebranded as innovation. Fish bones, often discarded after plantation meals, also became resources. Boiled down, they released minerals and flavor, forming broths that turned thin greens into hearty soups. Sometimes the heads were saved, eyes and all, simmered until soft enough to eat. Nothing was wasted. A fish skeleton might seem worthless, but in the quarters it meant soup to feed a family. That act of finding nourishment in waste speaks to the resilience of enslaved cooks. Today, fish, stock, and bone broth are staples in fine kitchens. Their roots, however, lie in the desperate creativity of people denied access to whole foods. Acorns, too, found their way into survival diets. Bitter, hard, almost inedible raw, they required labor to transform. Cracked, leached in running water to wash away tannins, then ground into coarse flour, acorns became bread or mush. It was work that cost energy, but in times of famine, it paid back in calories. Native Americans had long known how to process acorns into food, and enslaved people likely borrowed this knowledge, blending traditions of necessity across cultures. That acorn bread, rough and dense, carried families through lean seasons. Today, it has nearly vanished from common memory, though recipes linger in historical cookbooks. But each loaf once meant defiance against starvation. And then there was ashkak, simple, crude, and vital. Cornmeal mixed with water, patted into flat cakes, and baked directly in the ashes of a fire. No pan, no oven, just glowing embers and grit. The outer crust blackened, the inside baked soft. The taste was smoky, earthy, sometimes bitter from the ashes. But it was bread portable, filling, and sustaining. Ash cake became one of the most iconic survival foods of the enslaved South. It was carried into fields, eaten during long hours of forced labor, and even hidden away for midnight hunger. Today, it lives on in legend more than in practice, a symbol of resilience born from deprivation. Even clay, incredibly, became part of survival. Some enslaved people ate clay or soil in moments of extreme hunger, or as a way to quiet gnawing stomachs, called geophagy. This practice carried over from African traditions, where certain clays were believed to aid digestion or provide minerals. In America, it was often the desperate act of bodies starved of nutrients. While dangerous in excess, small amounts could calm the belly or provide iron. It is one of the starkest reminders of deprivation. People forced to eat the earth itself to keep moving. And yet, in some cultures today, clay consumption continues not as survival, but as ritual or tradition. Peanuts became one of the most significant, originally from South America, but embraced and spread across Africa before the slave trade. Peanuts held deep cultural resonance. On American plantations, they were often dismissed as ground peas, fit only for animals or the enslaved. Yet, boiled or roasted, they provided vital protein and fats. In some quarters, peanuts were ground into pastes, stirred into stews, or eaten raw. When hunger pressed too hard, children carried handfuls in pockets, chewing them slowly in the fields. Over time, peanuts became more than survival, they became cultural staples. From African-style groundnut stews to the birth of peanut butter in America. Their journey reflects both endurance and transformation. What was once considered food for the enslaved is now part of global cuisine. Sorghum syrup was another lifeline. Sorghum cane grew in southern soil. cheaper than sugarcane, and often used to make molasses-like syrup. For plantation owners, it was secredrate. For the enslaved, it was gold. Sorghum syrup was poured over ash cakes or mixed into corn mush, turning bland sustenance into something almost sweet. Its sticky texture clung to fingers and lips, and though it was far from luxury, it offered bursts of energy and comfort. In lean times, sorghum kept hunger at bay. Today, sorghum syrup still lingers in southern kitchens, drizzled over biscuits or baked into pies. But its roots lie in the cabins, where sweetness was survival. Wild berries, blackberries, dewberries, and huckleberries offered fleeting bursts of relief. Foraging in the woods or along fence lines, enslaved children often became berry gatherers. Their hands stained purple. They carried small baskets back to the cabins, sometimes eating as much as they picked. Berries were eaten fresh, mashed into juices, or dried for later. For many children, these wild finds were the closest thing to candy they ever tasted. Berries also carried healing power. Infusions of leaves or roots were used as medicines. Today, berry cobblers and preserves are celebrated southern deserts, but they began as the foraged sweetness of survival. Watermelon tells one of the most complicated stories. For the enslaved, it was both food and water. Its juicy flesh quenched thirst in scorching fields, its sweetness rare and nourishing. In the quarters, watermelon was cherished, eaten fresh in summer or pickled in brine for leaner months. Its seeds were roasted, its rind boiled into stews or preserves. Nothing was wasted. But over time, racist caricatures twisted watermelon into a symbol used to mock African Americans. The truth, however, is that watermelon was freedom food, soothsaying, refreshing, and versatile. To reclaim its story is to remember that its role began as survival, not stereotype. Cabbage often made its way into the diet, though not in lush heads from plantation gardens. More often, it was the outer leaves, the ones discarded by kitchens, tough, bruised, wilted, yet salvageable. Boiled down with salt or flavored with scraps, cabbage filled pots and bellies. Sometimes, it was fermented into rough kraut, lasting through winters when fresh greens disappeared. Its sharp bite and crunch offered variety in otherwise monotonous diets. And though scraps of cabbage may have felt degrading, enslaved cooks transformed them into meals that sustained. Today, cabbage rolls, stews, and slaws carry echoes of those survival strategies. Sweet potatoes grew easily in southern soil and became vital to the enslaved diet. Roasted in coals, mashed into mush, or sliced and fried when fat was available, they provided both energy and comfort. Sweet potatoes were one of the few foods that felt abundant, and families often grew small patches near their cabins. Their vines fed livestock, their roots fed people, their leaves became greens in stews. In the midst of deprivation, sweet potatoes were symbols of resourcefulness and resilience. Today, candied yams, sweet potato pies, and fries remain fixtures of southern cooking. But in the past, each roasted tuber meant strength for another day. Beans of every kind, cowpeas, lima beans, pole beans, became staples wherever enslaved people could plant gardens. Hardy and rich in protein, beans simmered for hours over cabin fires, often flavored with pork scraps or molasses if available. They were meals that stretched to feed many, filling the air with earthy aromas that softened hunger. Beans were also portable. Dried and stored, they could be carried into the fields or traded among the enslaved. And their versatility meant survival in countless forms: soups, stews, fritters. Today, beans remain at the heart of soul food, but their history is tied to the endurance of those who made feasts from famine.